Welcome to a quick build video for this Jem'Hadar Escort carrier. I posted a video of this build in an arena match, so I'll just go through the whole build here. This is more of a high-end build than other builds I've posted so far, so keep that in mind, especially when we get to the trait section. Starting with the gear, I have 4 dual beam banks in the front for maximum damage. Since this ship is a 4-3 layout, I couldn't fit the Piezo array in the front, but it has a wider arc, so I placed it in the rear, and when I'm flying I try to be aware of that. This ship is a little less maneuverable than others, so maybe it would be better to replace these 3 targeting link dual beam banks with arrays instead. In the rear, I have a standard crafted Omni phaser and the inhibiting phaser Omni from the Gamma reputation, which gives a -10 damage resistance debuff as long as we're moving faster than our enemy. That won't be often in this ship, and if we're attacking someone who's slowed or stuck in psi spam, that's where that benefit is worthwhile. My experimental weapon is the Alliance Hyper Cannon. This weapon does decent damage but has a slow travel time. The Soliton Impeller and others might be a better choice. If you have the time, check out my in-depth dive on experimental weapons if you want to know more about other options. There's a couple of side grades you may want to consider for certain situations. For equipment, I'm using the Romulan Deflector. It gives me a tiny bit more stealth as well as some stealth sight and nice resistances to control and drain. The rest is the 3-piece competitive set. That gives me a nice bonus damage resistance rating when hit with incoming energy damage, which is great for dealing with other dogfighters. The specific core is the bolstered core, which gives me exotic damage resistance, and the fortified shield, which can raise my hull capacity by 20%. I mentioned in some other videos that there are several configurations that work here. The 2-piece discovery set is a good option. Generally, you can play with the other slots however you like, as long as you keep the competitive engines. Those are not really negotiable on a PvP build. Now, before we get into the rest of it, I have to mention, and I hope if someone watches this video a while from now, it won't be a factor anymore, but for right now, currently a lot of intel abilities are bugged, and the most important one to talk about is evade target lock. When someone hits you with evade, you're disabled for a long time, and your tray is completely grayed out. When you're disabled, you can't activate anything besides team abilities and certain universal consoles. That part works correctly. The issue is that the amount of time you're disabled can't be resisted by your control skill, as it said in the patch notes, and there is no clear. Other disables can be cleared by hitting the engineering team ability, but at the moment, evade target lock can't be resisted or cleared. So with that in mind, my first console is the Picard maneuver, which I use to escape from holds and slows, and it has a short 1-minute cooldown. When you're disabled by evade target lock, this console can't be used, so I'd replace it with either Elachi Rift Jump or Fluidic Phase Decoupler, as long as evade target lock is broken. In my engineering row, I have overloaded SIF linkage from the Europa Battlecruiser. I don't have DPRM on this character, and this console grants me a large amount of damage, bonus damage resistance and lasts up to 20 seconds, with the added benefit of reducing the damage taken by teammates if they're nearby when I activate it. The only drawback of this console is it has a 60-second lockout, so you ideally only want one of these consoles per team if you're in an arena. Next is the Immolating Phaser Lance and Cutting Tractor Beam. The Lance adds great phaser spike damage to the 4 of this build, and Cutting Tractor has a passive that increases the damage of the Lance as long as we keep firing it and activating other universal consoles. The last slot is Hull Image Refractors, which is mainly here for the temporary hull it provides, not the active ability, which is more of a last resort situation. My science consoles are Bioneural Infusion Circuits, which adds control, hull capacity, and critical severity, all really useful in PvP, and Hostile Acquisition, which is a hold and damage resistance debuff. There's a lot of confusion about some of these effects. A hold works exactly like a disable, where it grays out the target's tray, but the difference is that a hold is also an interrupt and prevents all abilities from activating. For example, if I'm fighting someone and they use an ability that has a countdown like DPRM or Molecular Phase Inversion, the disable will not strip that buff, but Hostile Acquisition, this hold, will. The passive accuracy and control increases are also really good to have. In my tactical slots, I have Lorca's Fire Controls, which is a 2-piece set with the forward dual beam bank for more critical severity. and 4 colony protomatter consoles. And that's the bulk of our healing. As for the hanger, it doesn't really matter much because in this build I'm not wasting any traits or time keeping pets alive, so they die faster than I can get them out. The Orion interceptors have a nice chronoton torpedo slow and tractor beams, and the new Alliance squadrons have focused assault, so something along those lines is probably the best you can get here. My active specializations are Miracle Worker and Strategist. These two in combination can get me up to 50% increased incoming healing from those tactical consoles, so they work best in outright dogfights. In fights where I'm dealing with more controls or disables, it might be better to use Command as the primary spec for Boost Morale. Boost Morale is an active ability that can be used every 60 seconds that clears all debuffs for the entire team, and set Miracle Worker as secondary instead. For anyone not aware, when a specialization is set as secondary, you only get the first 2 tiers. It's not really explained very well, but for example, if Command is my secondary, I only get the benefits of Tier 1 and Tier 2. When it's primary, you get all 4 tiers. Moving on to personal traits, I have Context is for Kings. Both the damage, resistance, and bonus damage can be active at the same time, so it's a really good one. Fresh from R&R clears a control every 30 seconds, as well as reduces the cooldowns of our team abilities, which is super important for clearing debuffs and using our intel teams back to back. Give Your All dodges 20% of incoming damage even before resistances, which helps us stay alive. Intelligence Agent Attaché, this is because Sensor Scan and Subnucleonic Beam are really important in PvP. Even if I were a tactical captain, I'd still use this so I could use Attack Pattern Alpha and Tactical Fleet faster. Pseudo Submission is a nice placate if someone's trying to target us to prevent them from doing that. Redirected Armor Plating is another 30 damage resist, and since we're always taking damage from the sides and rear, it's up constantly. Repair Cruise is another good option here too. Self-Modulating Fire, I really like this one. 50% shield pen for 10 seconds is very useful for cracking through and dealing damage to the hull. Smuggler's Luck is really good as another control cleanse, but it only triggers if a shield facing is wiped out, so depending on who you're fighting and what they're using will dictate whether or not it's worth slotting this. Terran Targeting System gives me 15% more crit severity, and the slow effect is really minor. The last one is Boimler Effect, which helps ensure faster ability cooldowns. Now, for Starship traits, I'll talk about the defensive ones first. Rhythmic Rumble, of course, this greatly increases our resistances and decreases weapon power cost. Remember that temporary hull is not affected by resistances, so we want to keep our temporary HP up all the time. But when it inevitably gets wiped out by an attacker, they'll run into a wall of our regular HP pool, which benefits from the very high resist this trait offers. The next defensive trait is Invincible, which I always like to have for the occasional mistake. There are plenty of times where the stars aligned and I took a big hit. This trait saved me from dying and I was able to stay in combat for another 2 minutes and the trait recharged. This trait won't save you from getting ganged up on in ker'rat or fix a bad build, but in endgame arena matches it's a must-have. Offensively, one trait I would never go without is Super Weapon Ingenuity. This extends the length of Beam Overload to last 15 seconds in total, which is the same as Global, as in 100% uptime for Beam Overload. This is important because you never want to have an enemy on the run near death and suddenly your Beam Overload is down for 5 seconds and they have time to heal back up. This trait ensures constant, uninterrupted damage to wear down your target. As for the other 3 trait slots, there are a lot of side grades. In the last video, I used Weapon Emitter Overdrive from the Vaadwaur Juggernaut, which I wouldn't use if I didn't have Rhythmic Rumble because of the weapon power increase cost. Then Superior Area Denial and Cold Hearted. That setup gives me very high accuracy and critical chance, but I'm at a disadvantage because I do less damage to temporary hull. Once my target's temporary hull is down though, the -30 and -50 damage resist debuffs from Sad and Cold Hearted together drastically increase their damage taken, even if they had very high resistances to begin with. This also has the added benefit of increasing the damage anyone on my team attacking the same target does, since I'm lowering the target's damage resistance. I mentioned side grades for these traits. I don't want to make this video too long, but the easy ones to cover are preferential targeting, which adds 100% Cat 1 damage to beam overload. Superior pedal to the metal, which is a 30% Cat 2 for all damage dealt. And the best diplomat, which is also only for beam overload in this case, but ends up being roughly 22 to 23% Cat 2 on this build. All three of these traits add a lot to the base damage. That means temporary hull will melt away much more quickly, but then their damage resistances will still be there once you cut through. Finding the right balance between raw damage to deal with temporary hull and damage resistance debuffs to cut down the regular HP pull is all up to the specific team and situation. One of the best ways to do this might even be to have one teammate running all damage increase traits, while the other runs all debuff traits, and the two of you focus on the same targets, and so on. Three other traits worth mentioning that could be used here too. Exodus Active Probat grants 15% bonus damage as well as 40 control and some stealth. Since we're using Intel Team on this build, this is a good one to have to help with survivability, but it does a little less damage than the other three. Next is Good Day to Die from the 11th Anniversary bundle, which increases incoming healing and grants some bonus damage while you're under fire. Also a nice one for survivability and can be used on any ship, not just those with Intel seating. The last one, Invasive Maneuvers from the Alachi Frigate, grants no offensive advantage, but the phase out does make you really difficult to target and escapes from size spam holds and so on, so it can be used to great effect to avoid being killed if you're feeling a little fragile. Next is reputation traits. I'm using Dyson Advanced Targeting and Precision. Those two both get me more criticals, and the other three are more defensive. Advanced Hull Reinforcement is a nice bonus damage resistance rating. Evasive Tactics clears some control effects. Notably, this does not counter evade target lock at the moment. And Automated Protomatter Conduits provides some rapid regen. Automated Protomatter is the most situational here since we will have a lot of temporary hull. Temporary hull doesn't benefit from regen, so it might be better to swap this trait for something like Viral Engine's Overload or Tyler's Duality to provide a more offensive advantage. The bridge officer layout is next. On this ship, I'm only using one tactical buff. Tac Team to clear some debuffs and distribute shields. Cannon Scatter Volley triggers traits like Superior Area Denial or Preferential Targeting even though I don't have any cannons equipped. And Beam Overload is my main source of damage. Both of those abilities also activate our tactical healing consoles. The last slot is Focused Assault. Honestly, there isn't much to put here because this build uses attack pattern Lambda, so any attack pattern in this slot will conflict with that. You could slot Omega here as a way to escape slows, holds, disables, and so on, but then we lose Lambda, so it's very situational. Focused Assault grants everyone attacking the target you put some bonus damage, so since my traits are more geared toward debuffs, Focused Assault makes a lot of sense since it gives me 20% bonus damage to help cut through that temporary hull that I mentioned before. In the Lieutenant Commander seat, I'm using an Engineer. Emergency to engines is a must, and Aux to Sif is mainly there for the duty officer that grants a placate. However, with the change to evade target lock, if I took this into a match today, I would not run Aux to Sif. Instead, I'd run Aux to Damp instead with the DOF that extends Aux to Damp. Aux to Damp grants an immunity to disable as long as it's running, and with the DOF it's up 100% of the time, so I can't be disabled by evade target lock. The highest seat here is Lambda 3, which gives us some added perception and accuracy, as well as taking away some perception of our enemy. This works in concert with the 2 copies of Intel Team in my other seat. Since those grant us stealth, we can make our ship much harder, maybe impossible to target, by attacking our enemy with Lambda while cycling Intel Teams. Speaking of bugs from the Intel revamp, Lambda 3 at the moment actually adds accuracy to your attacker instead of removing it. Kind of funny that it's been like this for weeks now since it's just changing a plus to a minus, but whatever. Interestingly, Lambda 1 is not bugged and correctly reduces enemy accuracy, but I'm still going to use Lambda 3 for the maximum perception debuff here. It doesn't matter what my enemy's accuracy is if they can't target me anyway. In the other Universal seat, I have another Engineer. This one sports Engineering Team 1, which clears subsystem offline, disables, and other debuffs. and emergency power to shields 2, which helps keep my shields up since it reduces the amount of damage that they take. I would swap emergency to shields 2 for emergency to aux 2 if I wanted more stealth, and at the same time helping to increase my perception when dealing with another intel team using ship. Again, situational. My Science Seat is the same as always on these types of builds, Science Team 1 to clear debuffs, and Photonic Officer 1 to cover some cooldown time in case Boimler's doesn't proc. I'm hesitant to rely on Boimler's exclusively in PvP since one bad RNG cycle, and I might be waiting several seconds for my buffs to come up, which might result in a death. Okay, last part, Duty Officers. I'm using 20 of 47, which gets me 40 accuracy as well as some increased armor penetration, and the Con Officer that recharges evasive maneuvers instantly when using emergency to engines. Then I have the Aux to Sith Placate Doff, but as I mentioned before with the intel issues, I would use the Aux to Damp Doff instead right now. Next is a Warp Core Engineer that cleanses all debuffs. It's only a chance, but it appears to work on many debuffs, even those that don't have a direct counter. There's a blue and even a green variant of this Doff, so if you're on a tighter budget, just grab one of those. I grabbed a blue for my free-to-play build recently for about 2 million EC. Next is 37 of 47. That's just there as even more insurance when activating my 2 copies of Intel Team to make sure there's no downtime between them. As long as the devs think that a ship that is completely untargetable 90% of the time is perfectly fine and balanced, we may as well take advantage of it. The last slot is a Federation exclusive, Nurse, which grants 20% more hull regen, although I don't find this Doff particularly useful and would probably be better off swapping him for something else, like a Beam Overload Penetration Doff. So that's the build. It's always hard to structure these build videos when it comes to high-end PvP because so much of it depends not only on what someone has available in their gear or budget, but also PvP is the only situation in the game where you might actually have to adjust your build on the fly based on what the other team is doing. Unlike PvE, where you know exactly where the enemies are going to spawn and where, and exactly what to do every time, PvP is always changing as players will attempt different tactics and build IDs to try to beat you. And adapting your piloting and build to deal with that is a huge part of the skill involved with PvP. Thanks for watching.